Spies, Parsons, Fisher, and Engler were hung. But they sang the Marseillaise, the anthem of the International Revolutionary Movement, as they were being executed. Just before they were murdered, Spies shouted, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." Fielding and Schwab had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Lynn committed suicide by blowing himself up with a smuggled piece of dynamite, a blasting cap. Apparently, he put it in his mouth like a cigar. The trial has been described as one of the most serious miscarriages of justice in U.S. history. Most working people at the time believed the Pinkerton agents, the ones who did all kinds of bad things to the workers, provoked the incident. In fact, on June 26, 1893, Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld signed pardons for Fielding, Nibby, and Schwab after having concluded that all 8 defendants were innocent. The governor said the real reason for the bombings was the city of Detroit's failure to hold the Pinkerton guards responsible for shooting the workers. City of Chicago. Failure to hold them responsible. That action apparently ended his career. With the hysteria created after the Haymarket effect, combined with its more militant position, the Socialist Labor Party was able to reestablish its position as a leading revolutionary organization in the U.S. In 1890, a lawyer and a lecturer by the name of Daniel de Leon joined the SLP, becoming the party's national lecturer. He traveled around the country agitating for the SLP. He, along with many activists, including Emma Goldman, had recently become radicalized by the 1886 Workers' Campaign for an 8-hour day. Goldman once wrote, "The Haymarket affair had awakened the social consciousness of, quote, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people," end quote. Within a year or so, de Leon became a major leader in the socialist movement and the editor of a new English language weekly called The People. He maintained his position until his death in 1914. Although he never served as the official head of the SLP, he became known nevertheless as the guiding force of the SLP through his control of its press. He was known for his sharp intellect and character assassinations. He was not a very nice fellow.
He's a lawyer.
Okay. But so was Lenin. Within a year or so, de Leon became the major leader in the socialist movement. I already said it. Under his leadership, the SLP came to argue for revolutionary industrial unionism, or social industrial unionism. In his conception, the party would not lead the unions in the day-to-day struggles, but instead would organize a revolutionary union to fight for socialism. This union would be pure in theory and uncorrupted in practice from the very start. In 1896, the SLP launched the Socialist Trade Union and Labor Alliance. It opposed the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which was formed 10 years earlier. Many socialist trade union leaders and their unions deserted the AFL to join the Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance, but they became disenchanted with the alliance's unwillingness to fight for basic concessions for workers. By 1898, many of these socialists left the alliance. The Socialist Labor Party did not have a monopoly, however, on the socialist movement. Many socialists were independent. I want to discuss for a minute, I want to digress for a moment to discuss a phenomena called the Christian Socialist Movement. It was a short-lived phenomenon in the U.S., lasted maybe 10 years. In 1889, a small group of white ministers formed the Society of Christian Socialists. Their goal was to show that the aim of socialists is embraced in the aim of Christianity. This movement did not attract many people and disappeared, for the most part, within 10 years. It nevertheless had a deeper impact on African American ministers. It was through the debates in the pages of the Christian Recorder and the AMA Church Review that many black people learned of socialism. Both were publications of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and are still published today. The Christian Recorder generally held the view that socialism was a, quote, pernicious doctrine, end quote. On the other hand, the AME Church Review argued that, quote, socialism was a proper form of society for all workers, including African Americans, end quote, and cited the Bible to reinforce their arguments. Another minister, Reverend James Holly, who was a former shoemaker and advocate of immigration of African Americans to Haiti, called for the application of biblical socialism to cure the evils of modern capitalist society. There was another Reverend Ransom. He was eventually elected a bishop in the AME Zionist Church. He argued that socialism was the logical and inevitable answer to the poverty and unemployment across the country. He pointed out that a socialist society was particularly suited to the African American who, quote, belonged almost wholly to the proletarian or industrial class, end quote. During the first part of the 20th century, several prominent African American ministers would emerge as leaders in the Socialist Party, and I'll discuss this later. Going back to 1893, there was another major recession. It was called the Panic of 1893, and it was initiated by the collapse of the Reading Railroad. Unemployment skyrocketed. The Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages as demands for their trains plummeted and the revenues dried up. 3,000 workers at the company went on a wildcat strike in response to wage cuts, 12-hour workdays, and high rents in the company town of Pullman, Illinois. Many of these workers were members of the American Railway Union, the nation's first industry-wide union led by Eugene V. Debs. It supported the strike by launching a boycott of Pullman cars. Within 4 days, 125,000 workers on 25 railroads had quit work rather than handle Pullman cars. The New York Times described the strike as a, quote, struggle between the greatest and most important labor organization and the entire railroad capital, end quote. And the New York Times said eventually it involved 250,000 workers in 27 states. Eventually the strike was broken when U.S. Marshals and 12,000 Army troops were deployed, leading to the deaths of 13 strikers and the wounding of another 57. The strike leader, Eugene Debs, was put on trial. He was found guilty of violating a court injunction and served 6 months in jail. While he was in jail, he was visited by socialists who gave him the works of Karl Marx. And that's how he became a socialist. Upon his release, he became the leading socialist in the country. He came to believe that union action by itself was insufficient to bring about the liberation of the working class. At the final meeting of the American Railway Union in 1897 in Chicago, the affairs of the union were finalized and the organization was shut down. The convention was then reopened, and representatives of the Socialist Labor Party, the sectarian Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance, which was affiliated with the SLP, and an assortment of other unions and groups, including those that still advocated the establishment of socialist cooperative colonies, were all in attendance. They formed a group called the Social Democracy in America, but it didn't last long. Many of the activists, the socialists, left because they just couldn't stand this socialist colonization scheme that some of the utopian socialists were pushing. So they left to form the Social Democratic Party of America. Meanwhile, a factional split occurred in the SLP, called the Rochester SLP. They also formed a Social Democratic Party of America. It was obvious their intention was to collaborate and come together. And they ran a unity slate which featured Eugene Debs from the Social Democratic Party #1 and Joe Harriman from the second Social Democratic Party as a vice presidential candidate. They held a convention in 1901